and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And I have back with me Simon Tolkien, and we're going to be talking about book two in his Theo Sterling duology, which they're calling a duology, but you never know what's going to happen in the future. Hi, Simon.
Hi, PatZi. Thank you for having me on.
The fact is, I am not tired of Theo at all. I love Theo.
Good.
It's funny. The other day I stubbed my toe. Now, I haven't stubbed my toe for years, and I suddenly, as the pain is shooting through me, I am carried back to the last few chapters of your book where there is some talk of torture. And I'm thinking, oh my God, if I couldn't stand the stubbing my
Right,
toe, what
right.
would I do if I was faced with what's happening near the end of the book?
Yes. Yeah, there's some terrible things that happen in the Room of Lost Steps. A lot worse than happens in the palace at the end of the sea.
Yes, they're in the palace. Of course, we have a lot of. He's running a lot, so we keep worrying that he might fall down. But it's not this terrible time in Barcelona. I'll have you explain what's happening because most people don't know much about this period of time
Sure.
prior to World War II. But what happened in Spain during those years is so significant. And
Hmm.
when you look back on it, also what America's attitude was and why, and of course, the president at the time and Franklin Roosevelt, his ideas about Spain, it's
Hmm.
all meshed up, but it comes around. History, unfortunately, repeats itself.
Hmm.
And so you've really captured, I think, a very timely subject.
I think that's right. The palace at the end of the sea takes place over a longer period. It's going from 1929 really up until 1936, and the Room of Lost Steps covers just 1 year, which is really from July 1936 through to the fall of 1937. And the palace at the end of the sea sets up everything that then takes place. It's pretty soon into the Room of Lost Steps that the army rebellion occurs in Barcelona, in which the army led by Franco is trying to overthrow the democratically elected Republican government. And there is street fighting in Barcelona, where the hero Theo is, because he is about to participate in the alternative Olympiad, the People's Olympiad. And he participates in the street fighting there on July the 19th and 20th, which very surprisingly led to the defeat of the army by the anarchist workers. And it's that experience which really shapes the novel as it then develops from there. And indeed, Theo's fateful decision to join the international brigades and fight in the war itself around Madrid at the beginning of 1937.
Of course, the duology is a coming of age story, and by the end of Room of Lost Steps, Theo has learned a lot. He's gone through a lot. And when you look back on it, when you got the idea for the book, how fully formed was it? I love that what you started off with his mother being a
Mm.
Mexican immigrant to the United States. So this opened up all this possibility of eventually him landing up in Spain. So how fully formed was it? It's really exciting to see the progress of Theo's life.
I suppose you're also talking about the progress of what was happening inside my head as well. And it took a very long time because I first started thinking about this and coming up with the idea for a plot back in the fall of 2016. We're now in the fall of nearly in the fall of 2025. So that's nearly 9 years. And 7 of those were spent on this project. It took a long time to write and research and indeed plot what was going to happen. And it's difficult for me now to know exactly what came first and what came last. But I knew that he was going to need to be a Spanish speaker because I knew that the book was going to be about the Spanish Civil War and that he would therefore have to have an experience of Spain, which, unlike others who volunteered to fight there, would involve him being able to speak the language. And I think that therefore led to the idea that his mother would be a refugee from Mexico. And Mexico later came to be so important because his mother, who is a very fervent Roman Catholic, has had a very vivid and extreme experience as a result of the persecution of the church in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution in the early part of the last century. And her response to that fashions her response to the politics in Spain when they get there. But of course, what she will not accept is that the situation of the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico was very different to the situation that it was in Spain. In Mexico, it was a persecuted church where priests were being hunted down. And early on in the Palace at the End of the Sea, we hear about the martyrdom of a priest who was shot in Mexico City. Whereas in Spain, the church was extremely powerful and aligned with the army and the landowners in order to preserve the status quo. And this Theo finds extremely difficult when he's relating to his mother, because he feels very strongly that the social situation and the political situation in Spain is unjust, and he is on the side of the people who are fighting the army, and that pitches him and his mother on different sides of the political divide, which has fatal real consequences for their relationship ultimately.
His father is Jewish, which in New York, in book one, The Palace at the End of the Sea, is a capitalist. There was a problem with socialism in New York, which is then carried through both books.
Then this experience of the labor unrest through his father's factory in New York, as you rightly say, introduces Theo to communism and socialism, which have very strong bearing at that time in the beginning of the 30s in New York because of the effects of the Great Depression. And it also, his Jewish roots and discovering them, his father was a Jew who had been thrown out by his family because of marrying a Gentile. And in the beginning of the Palace, in the chapter called Kidnap, he actually meets his grandparents, his grandfather having kidnapped him for a day for the first time. So he is aware of that, and he is aware of that so many of the workers who are being paid starvation wages in his father's factory are Jewish. But these experiences have significant ramifications in the Room of Lost Steps, because he is going in Spain into a world where he is meeting many people who have also volunteered to fight in the international brigades because they are either communist or Jewish or both. And in the second part of the Room of Lost Steps, that becomes a major theme, the disillusionment with the communist leadership and the Jewish motivation for the boy Manny, who becomes his best friend inside the Lincoln Battalion. The international brigades were formed under the initiative of the Communist Party. Many people who were not communists, including Theo, joined them, but the battalions, as part of the brigade, are divided up by their nationality, and therefore the Lincoln Battalion was the original American contingent. That subsequently expanded to become the Washington Battalion, and indeed another battalion, because over 3,000 Americans volunteered to fight for the Spanish Republic, crossing the seas and making that sacrifice to do, and many of them actually never came back. So that was where the Lincoln Battalion came from. And the book is, The Room of Lost Steps, is in part about the experience of the Lincoln Battalion. The Lincoln Battalion had the most appalling experience at one of the first great Spanish battles, which is a set piece in the book called the Battle of Jarama. And after the Battle of Jarama, they lost so many people that the new recruits into the Lincoln Battalion, the communists kept the new recruits separate from those who had fought at the Battle of Jarama in a special different place and called them Washington Battalion, because they didn't want the two battalions to meet, because they felt that the Washingtons' morale would be undermined if they found out what had actually happened to the Lincolns.
The Lincoln that was completely disorganized. It was a slaughter.
Yes, and the book describes what happens at Jarama. I don't want to spoil it, but
Yeah.
how many people who were actually untrained were sent into battle for a purpose that was really never going to be accomplished without any of the promised air or tank support, and were real cannon fodder as they were going up this hillside towards the fascist position.
Of course, you had to immerse yourself in various types of history, military history. You had to analyze labor history and just finding out all the details about life in Spain at the time. And what
Well,
I love about your books are all the little details that you have that make the
mm,
book so, it has so much depth.
I think that's absolutely right. What helped in relation to the war part, which is the second part, was that many, I suppose about 50 of the Lincoln Brigade, the Lincoln Battalion volunteers who returned back to America after the end of the Spanish Civil War wrote accounts of their experiences. None of these are now in print, but I was able to access them by going through Amazon and finding them in these book depositories. And I read them all. And they gave a first hand account of what it was like to go from America to cross over the Pyrenees in the middle of the night on these goat trails, and some of them dying in the process, and then to be thrown with very little training into these battles and trench warfare in the areas around Madrid. And so I was able to, by reading them very closely, build up a strong, visceral sense of what it was like, which, as well as the actual history of the place. And that's, I think, really helped me to create that, to create a strong sense of what it was like, which is what one tries to attain as a historical fiction writer, but which we're really helped towards if there are good primary materials.
Yeah, I've watched the documentaries of those men, mostly men, who went, and they went with such enthusiasm. They believed in what they were doing. They were so enthusiastic. They were so happy to be going, even though their families were terrified and they didn't want them to go, and the country didn't want them to go. But they went. And so most of what we know about that period, of course, I think for most people, the furthest they've gone into Spanish history after Christopher Columbus, the only thing they know is what Ernest Hemingway wrote.
Who are you referring to, PatZi? Are you referring to people who are reading now or the volunteers who went out there?
The volunteers were young and enthusiastic and believed.
I think they had a very visceral, clear idea of fascism. I think they saw what Hitler was about, and indeed what Mussolini had done in Ethiopia, and the beginning of the strong persecution of the Jews in Germany. And I think that they felt that this was the place that they could fight it, and that's what they went to do. But that didn't mean that they had any real clear understanding of what Spain was about. And indeed, even though they were in Spain, they didn't really see Spain itself at all. They saw trenches in which they were with other Americans. They didn't see the fascists who they were fighting. And their experience of Spain itself was very limited. And I think that they found when they did see it, when they were sent on leave to these villages and stuff, they found the Spain, which was practically medieval in its agriculture, very difficult to identify with, particularly as they couldn't speak the language. And that's why it was so important, going back to what we were talking about initially, for me to make Theo a Spanish speaker, and not only a Spanish speaker, but somebody who had actually lived in Spain and fallen in love with it. And that's why the whole of the third part of The Palace at the End of the Sea is set in a fictional Spanish village in the years before the outbreak of the Civil War, because that's where Theo forms his experience of Spain. So his experience, his knowledge of Spain and relationship to it is very different from the people who he is fighting with. And this, in a certain sense, separates him from them as well.
With Theo, we start in book one that he is a runner, and how you've woven that subject into the book and carried it on into book two with the alternate Olympics. So all of this was a lot of research.
It's an enormous amount of research. The whole research took over 3 years for both books, which is longer than the writing. But I think there's an alchemy with writing, if it goes well, which is that things that you start with turn out to bear fruit in ways that you didn't expect. And therefore, I started out with Theo as a runner in New York. I was interested in that, and I didn't appreciate at the time until later that it was going to have such ramifications because of the People's Olympiad in Barcelona. And the background to that is that there was, just as we have now, there were rival cities competing for where the Olympics should be held. And before the Nazis came to power in 1933, it was settled that the 1936 Olympics would be held in Berlin. And then when it became apparent that it was going to be in Berlin, the Spain and in Catalonia decided that Barcelona, who had come second in the competition, would hold an alternative People's Olympiad as a protest and, if you like, counter games to the one in Berlin. So Spain had teams there, and Russia sent its teams there, and various other countries sent athletes to participate, whilst also sending athletes to Berlin. So Jesse Owens went to Berlin and won, as we know, the 100 meters in front of Hitler. But it was the left wing, the communist and socialist and union organizations in countries like England and America that sent over teams to participate. And Theo is going to run in these games. But what happened was that the army rebellion in Spain took place on the night of 18th to 19th July, which meant that the games that were due to start the next day had to be cancelled. So he has had this experience, this amazing experience of feeling that he's going to represent his country and have this marvelous moment, and then it's taken away from him as a result of what happens.
And you didn't know about this alternate Olympics?
I didn't know that he, as a runner, would give rise to this, to the Olympics in Barcelona, until later on. It was only during the process of research that opportunity, if you like, for me became apparent. And then, additionally, really developing the alchemy theme, it also became clear to me that Theo, as a runner, would enable me to describe the Battle of Jarama and the horrors that went on there in a different way if he was going to be used, rather like Mel Gibson in the movie of Gallipoli, as a runner who would run between different commanders and therefore be able to actually see at first hand how really bad commands were sent down from the staff behind, leading Captain Merriman, the leader of the Lincoln Brigade, in the trenches to say that memorable line, "It's murder, but it's got to be done." And he sends the Lincolns over the top. And so many of them die as a result.
And I love how you write about the battle. That was absolutely perfect. The
Mm.
that he would run between and deliver the messages. And one of my favorite scenes is the one where he sees Maria in a truck and he starts running and he's trying to chase the truck, trying to find out where she's going.
That's different from the battle. But in Barcelona, in part one, the running helps again because he's sent by one anarchist leader to run over to the other anarchist leaders. So his function as a runner, both in relation to the street fighting in Barcelona and the battle at Jarama, enables the reader to seamlessly see what is actually happening in terms of the anarchist strategy or the Lincoln Battalion attack on the relevant times, which is important because you cannot tell a reader, I think, if you want to write good historical fiction, what is happening. The reader has to learn about it seamlessly in the same way as the characters do. So you have to find a way to do that. And the running enabled me to do that. The alternative is for the author to walk into the middle of this and start explaining to the reader about why the strategy at Jarama got screwed up and why the anarchists were doing X, Y, or Z on the streets of Barcelona, which completely cuts off the suspension of disbelief and the immersion in the actual story. So I'm not prepared to do that. I want to find ways not to do that.
You captured it perfectly because you have a wonderful arc. The reader is running with him. The reader is
Precisely,
worried
yeah.
about the bullets. The reader is running and stepping over bodies, and you
Yeah,
feel it. It's gross. It's
yeah, there's
disgusting.
that. And yeah, and in the trenches, as he's jumping over people inside the trench, it's very difficult to run down a trench. It becomes even more exciting because he's having to get there in front of the actual runner who was sent on first in order to countermand the information which is being brought by the first runner, because he's the lieutenant who has sent him has seen that there is going to be no air support and there's going to be no tank support, and so he's sent Theo to tell the captain about what the situation is. The horror is that even though he succeeds in getting there in advance of the actual runner because of going so fast, what he does is useless, as it turns out, because the attack is still ordered, notwithstanding the fact that he's told them the situation on the ground, because the colonel back behind the lines refuses to believe it.
That arc, when you're writing those scenes, and they're fast paced, they're happening, boom, boom.
Yeah,
Are you writing like that? Do you feel that same sort of excitement as are your fingers running along that fast?
I think it's a different challenge to write that kind of book. I think this is at the root of all this. The Room of Lost Steps is a highly paced, exciting, action filled book. The Palace at the End of the Sea is not that, but The Room of Lost Steps can only be what it is because of what has been set up for the characters, and not just Theo, a whole range of characters within the palace. It's not slower, but it's different. It's not taking place in war or revolution, but the setting up of war and revolution occurs in palace. These books were originally envisaged and for a long time were one book. But the project grew to be so great that it really became not just, it wasn't about the Spanish Civil War, but it was about the whole decade, the whole of the 30s, running from 1929 to 1937, from the Wall Street crash until halfway through the Spanish Civil War, and in America and in England and in Spain. And so as it got bigger and bigger, the book itself got bigger and bigger, and that's why it had to be split into two. But it's one big whole. So tomorrow is a day of celebration for me in one sense, because with the publication of The Room of Lost Steps, people are now going to be able to read both. There's not, oh my gosh, I've got halfway and I'm sitting on the edge of a cliff and, you know, what's going to happen next? That's now done. So that's a great moment for me.
It is. Both books are, I think they're both great. I love historical fiction. That's my favorite. I love historical fiction because when you read something about time in history and it's well written, like, of course, this book is, it stays with you. You learn and you don't realize you're learning. It becomes part of you. It's now, as I said, what else is going to happen to Theo? You feel like you know him, you care about him. And that runs through the books. And then all the history, whether it's learning about labor unions, whether it's learning about the relationship between, even when we get to England and to the school, learning those relationships and the people there that he meets and
Right.
later on carry on into other parts of his life. It's a great way to learn history.
Thank you. And that's wonderful to know. But this is actually a different kind of historical fiction in a way. And what we were talking about running really informs that. What this book is doing is it's marrying history to fiction. And I didn't know I was going to be able to do that. But especially in Barcelona, everything that happens actually happened. And the fiction introduced into 2 days of events that occurred in the geography and in the time given. So that when Theo wakes up in his athlete's hotel in the Plaza España in Barcelona and sees the fighting outside in the dawn, he can barely make it out in the light. And he sees the shooting and decides to go out. He's going out into the beginning of the army rebellion. And then he runs down the boulevard to get away from it, and he gets to the barricade. And then what happens on the barricade, halfway down the boulevard, the parallel, is what next happens during that fighting. And afterwards, he meets the leaders, and he then goes to the Plaza Catalunya, and he sees soldiers being evacuated from the hotel, which is on the front cover of the book. So he is participating in real events in the order, timing, and geography that they actually occurred. And so I think that is, in a way, what makes developing what you were describing, what makes the book, in a certain sense, so special. I was able also to do that at the two battles at Jarama and again at Brunete, to actually set the fiction within a very dramatic history happening actually at that time. And that was really interesting to me.
You've immersed yourself into the period. For example, I love the scene with the mattress. He gets into a hotel room where a mattress has been used to cover a window, and he starts to move it, and it's heavy. And most people wouldn't even think about the fact that mattresses in those days, especially in a hotel, would have been heavy. They were made of coil. They had springs inside of them that were really strong. And so a mattress, when you moved it, it was a really heavy thing. But just capturing that little moment, I thought was so good. I like that. And there's lots of places where people wouldn't even think.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm really glad you picked up on that, because I'd love to talk about that a little more. First of all, in relation to the mattress, the room is the room where he goes with the girl he loves, and the mattress, there's this combination between love and war, because the mattress has been used by the soldiers who were in the room before they were evacuated as a shield against bullets coming in through the window. And so the mattress becomes what they love, but also he finds at the same time, or just after, he finds bullet holes in the mattress. So there is this physical proximity, or bullets actually in the mattress. And he actually extracts the cartridge, the bullet, from the mattress and throws it out of the window, where there are all the fires going on out in the Plaza Catalunya. So there is this contrast. There is this union of love and war within that mattress. And then at the same time, as you say, the weight of the mattress means that it's incredibly tense, dramatic moment when they're actually coming together after all these years, the moment is also diffused because the mattress is so heavy that, precisely as you've described, he falls over. And so, in a kind of Chaplinesque way, the moment works because it becomes comic. And all of this arises out of that mattress. And so I love this in novel writing, where you can take a physical object, which you've perceptibly focused in on, the mattress, and so much comes out of it, which affects the way in which people are relating to each other and the themes in the book itself.
When I read that, I said to myself, oh, he knows his stuff. My biggest
Yeah.
compliment to historical writers is, do they know their stuff? I thought that was great. While we're on the idea of the mattress, right at the end of that chapter, there's a part where he looks back at the bed, and you write something like, where they had lain. And this is why your writing shines above so many others, because I think the average writer would have said where they had made love, which is so obvious. But partly because a lot of them wouldn't know how to use the past participle. So they'd be worried about where they had lied, where they had laid, where they had did. But of course, being from Oxford, all you had to do.
No. Going beyond the mattress, the room is so important, because the room is where this is a very affluent and rich hotel. It's it's the plaza of the Barcelona at the time. So that's where he goes with his rich stepfather when they arrive there. And then later, it's taken over by the soldiers and then by the anarchists. But then later, the hotel itself is taken over after these events by the Communist Party. And then that feeds into the whole sense of disillusionment that he has, which comes from the Communist Party. And so when he returns to Barcelona and sees Maria again, she points up to the room where they were together and where they were happy. And there's an enormous photograph, and this is straight true. There's a photograph of Stalin hanging over the very window and Lenin to the side, because the Communist Party, and this, in a certain sense, illustrates and encapsulates for him the whole way, and for her, in which the Communist Party has ruined everything. That's why I was so grateful to my publishers that they were able to, put the hotel on the front cover of the book. And you can actually see the hotel itself there. So that was really wonderful.
I love the covers for both of the books, and I like that sort of colorful flowing fabric that goes across, which
Yeah.
again reminds me of running and carries that sort of whole theme
Yeah,
of
I was
flow.
so pleased about that, because that building is so full of hope and disillusionment, and so much happens there, that it was wonderful that they actually found that picture and then presented it as they did. I like it.
When you were writing the details there of those 2 days, how did you do your research? Now, of course, you walked the streets. When I was doing research, I love to go either very early in the morning or late at night to do the walk through. What about you?
Yeah, I can answer that. I went to Barcelona in 2019, very clear about what I wanted, and I was there for between a week and 10 days. And I had a guide who was an expert on the Spanish Civil War in Barcelona to take me around and show me everything. And I walked the streets from morning till night, plotting out how everything worked and how it would all work. And what I was referring to before about this route that Theo takes, which is a triangle going through the streets of Barcelona, matching the development of the street fighting on that day and the next day. I was able to actually see how, as I walked the streets, how that was going to happen. And in relation to Barcelona, it was very much physical research on the ground with the help of my tour guide. But something really strange happened when I was in Barcelona. I think perhaps one of the most strangest things that's ever happened to me with researching one of my books, which is that about 2 or 3 days before I was about to leave, I mentioned that I was going to go to the Sagrada Familia Church. Not that I was going to have that figure in the book, but it's a very famous church designed by the architect Antoni Gaudi, which everybody knows. It's now really the most famous landmark in Barcelona. And my guide said that he had a colleague who knew about the anarchists specifically and wanted me to meet her. And when I met her, she told me, "Oh, did you know that the other building, which is so famous for Gaudi, which is called the Güell Palace just off the Ramblas, was used as a communist secret interrogation center and headquarters during the Civil War," which I didn't know. I had no intention of going there. So I cancelled, I changed my plans, and I went to the Güell Palace. And immediately I got there, you go up this staircase as if into another world, because everything is so ornate and thick and muffled. It's as if you've left the world behind. And I knew once I got in there quite quickly that that was where this book would end. And in it, I discovered the real Room of Lost Steps. And it's in that room that everything comes to a head and the entire duology reaches its climax. So it was as if the room and the palace and the title and the climax were waiting for me in that city, but I could have just missed it if not for this accident of her telling me that.
Sometimes things are just meant to be. In
I felt
Yiddish, we
so
say
lucky.
beshert.
And then
And
there was the pandemic, PatZi, which came the next year, and I would not have been able to go back. So it's an extraordinary thing. It's one of the luckiest things that happened to me.
fortuitous.
Yeah, beyond that, just amazing. Like when I went into the room of lost steps, I knew, and I could easily have never got there.
Wow. Gave you a great ending, I can tell you. And every time I stub my toe, I will think about it. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the characters. Of course, let's talk about Maria. Now, Maria, we let's not tell the ending at all. Don't get close
Please
to
don't
that.
do that. Please.
But let's talk about when he meets her and talk a little bit about anarchy and communism because again at this time we have a war in Europe. We have communists all over the place.
Maria hates the communists.
Yeah.
The anarchists hated the communists. They thought that the Russian Revolution was a complete betrayal of left wing ideology. And this goes back to the First International and the great split that occurred between Marx and Bakunin, is that Marx's idea was that in order to bring in the utopian communist world, that you needed a medium, which was the state, to make it happen, from which we get the Leninist dictatorship of the proletariat and everything. And the anarchists believed that the state was the enemy and that any form of state control would lead to the power of one person over another person, which is what they were against. That's why they were against money, because everything that empowers one person over another. And there is this major split between communism and anarchism. But as you rightly say, people back, and I'm not saying about you, you weren't there then, people at the beginning of the 1930s, 90 years ago, they had a very different understanding, particularly in the West, of communism than they did later during the Cold War. And the communists seemed to be the only people who were actually in the Communist Party in America, seemed to be the only people who were actually standing up for the workers and trying to help them in their struggles to form unions. And there was a lot of suffering in relation to that, or to help the poor black people who were the victims of Jim Crow in the South. The Communist Party seemed to be the only ones who were doing that. And so I think it was an early days in communism, and Stalin was presenting a very sanitized view of what was going on in the Soviet Union. And people thought that capitalism was failing because of the Great Depression and that this was the last stage of its decline. So all these ideologies were in a different state, different phase, and they hadn't really been tested. Maria is an anarchist, and comes out of a Spanish village where she has had the experience, and in a very visceral way, that she has no power over herself or indeed her body, because her dreadful father is using her beauty to trade in to marry her off to this ghastly man who was the head of the local council, the cacique, so that he can advance himself within that society. And at the end of the palace, at the end of the sea, without spoiling it, that's how she gets away from him and gets away from that happening after she's being held prisoner there. So she has that experience, the experience of being a woman and being like basically treated as a chattel. And she also has the experience of the massive injustice in Spanish society, which she's witnessed firsthand. And that's led her to anarchism. And anarchism in the period before the Civil War spread like wildfire through a rural population, and indeed the population in Barcelona, that was that had become completely disillusioned with the church, which was basically saying the meek will go to heaven, but for now you stay meek and you stay poor and you maintain the status quo. And they had turned from that to anarchism, which had become like another religion. The problem for anarchism is that if you actually win, which the anarchists did in Barcelona, and you institute a revolution and you collectivize, then in order to run an economy and run a society, particularly if it's at war, then you need some form of state control to do that. And so you had the situation where some of the anarchists became ministers in the government, and other anarchists saw this as a complete betrayal of everything they stood for. And in a way, they were ineffectual because their own philosophic position was incompatible. Whereas, of course, the communist position, which is that you do need state control, they were saying win the war and then we'll have the revolution, was the communist mantra. That does work. And so that's why the communists, particularly because they were backed by Russia, which was the only people that would support the republic, was so successful during the war. The anarchists, or most of the anarchists in the book, are in love with violence.
Yes.
And the whole situation when they win against the army in Barcelona and take over Barcelona, there is what is called the Red Terror, which is described in some detail in the book, particularly with the anarchist attack on, there's a set piece in the book where the anarchists attack a monastery in the northern part of Barcelona, the Carmelite monastery, which is a whole chapter in the book deals with that. And it's a horrific day. I visited that place too.
One of the things that's remarkable in the book is how casually they talk about destroying things. Just, okay, that church
Yes.
is going to be burnt down.
I totally understand your response, but the buildings to the anarchists and the poor represented the empowerment of 1% over of the population over the 99. And the church gave that a kind of ideological basis, so they were the enemy.
Nothing much changes, huh?
I don't write history on that basis. I'm not allegorical. I don't write history because, oh yeah, I think that event is parallel to the event that is occurring now. Certainly, the world is a story that goes through chapters which resonate one from the other, and we don't learn our lessons, and all of that is absolutely true. But I write history or historical fiction, because it's so fascinating. And it's so extraordinary that these people lived and now they're dead, and now we can't contact them at all. We have vestiges that they left behind, whether it be, as you say, in buildings or in books or stuff, but we can't touch them. But we can get close, and historical fiction provides one, if it's done well, with that ability to get really close. And then you see that these people who lived before lived just as much as we live, and that they are in a continuum, and that's magical.
To take yourself back in time to a period and get to know the time, the period, the people, and really immerse yourself in it. This is part of being a writer. It's so much fun.
I wasn't able to do that to begin with. When I started off as a writer a quarter of a century ago, and that was later in my life, I didn't have that kind of ability or skill or confidence. And I was writing courtroom dramas, and I was writing about what I knew from being a lawyer. And it's only over time that I've been able to switch to character related fiction and to historical fiction. But once I actually got to this point, it is magnificent because the characters live. And the characters are like people I've known. I can sit in a chair and close my eyes, and there they are in front of me, talking real, flesh-like. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to create that. But it takes a long time, a long process of development.
Tell us about Theo's stepfather, because I think he is a fabulous character. And how did he come out?
I like him. I like the way in which he changes so much from the beginning. And I wanted to see, because I suppose the first book I wrote, which was also known as The Stepmother, Final Witness, was about whether or not the boy's father's new wife had conspired to kill the first wife. And there's a trial and all the rest of it. So it's pretty much a step relationship, which has gone as bad as it can be, PatZi. But I wanted to see whether a step relationship could be successful. And this starts as badly as it could be, because Theo feels that he has, one, that the introduction of a stepfather is a betrayal of his own father, and two, that he feels he's being taken away from his life with his mother and from his own country. And he lays the blame for that, fairly or unfairly, on his stepfather. So they start out as badly as they can be. But gradually over time, and indeed because of what I've referred to as the trouble that the mother has, or that there exists between Theo and his mother in relation to the church in Spain, that brings in the stepfather too. And they begin to, like, as the mother becomes more sick, they see a way to relate to each other. And then over time, as a result of terrible things that happen, their relationship changes. So I was really interested in trying over the course of the two books to see how a relationship could go and develop from one polar opposite of suspicion and enmity to the opposite, where really they become family to each other. And that was interesting to me. And if you like the father, obviously, Andrew, that kind of succeeds. So I'm pleased about that, because that was one of the most important character arcs, or certainly one of the first, in the novel, in both novels.
He works. He just, I think in his scenes, he steals the scenes. It's like a Hollywood film. You have a character who comes in and steals the scene. Whenever he's involved in a story, just his attitude, his personality, the way he does change, and the way he looks at both sides, trying to understand Theo.
That too. And he has, PatZi, a sense of history. It makes him unsure, but he can see history in its full context. I think he has a wider perspective, and nowhere is this more true than the fact that he has had the actual experience of fighting in the trenches on the Western Front in the First World War. And he tries to convey that experience to Theo. He doesn't want to, because nobody wants to talk about an experience that you've had like that. But he fails to convey his experience and fails to stop Theo going to Spain. And all he can give him is his father's rosary and the hope that he will stay alive. But he has had that experience. And Theo, when he gets involved in the battles at Jarama and Brunete and the horrors, realizes that his stepfather was right. But hearing something in words is no substitute for experiencing it in reality. And that, of course, feeds into the book that I wrote before this, duology, which was No Man's Land, which is being reissued in November, which is about the First World War. It is another coming of age story, which I hope you might read, PatZi, which is about a boy, again, like Theo, who grows up in England but goes to fight in the trenches in the First World War and has really appalling experiences. It's even more of a war book than this is.
Oh, I will read it. The First World War is a particular period of time that I'm interested in, because I was interested in a young Churchill. So I was
Sure.
following along Churchill's life. And of course, he went to the trenches.
After what he did in Gallipoli,
Yes,
because
after,
this
oh,
idea
yes,
of
Gallipoli
opening
was
up
a
that
disaster.
front, which led to such a disaster, and it was really to exorcise that and redeem himself that he became a colonel in the trenches. He was very much responsible for that mess.
Absolutely.
I had Churchill as a character in one of my books. I researched him in great detail because I had to have him talk in the book. I had to find out how he talked and all that. It's my book Orders from Berlin, which I wrote before No Man's Land, which is about when I used to write thrillers. It's about a Nazi plot to infiltrate MI5 and assassinate Churchill in the immediate run up to the beginning of in 1940, when it was hoped that a change of government over to Halifax or somewhere like that might lead Britain to cave in and sign a peace. And it was felt that if Churchill was removed, then everything would change. And that was the basis for my book. Those were in the days when I wrote thrillers, but had started to write historical fiction. So it's a kind of marriage of the two. And then afterwards, I wrote No Man's Land about the First World War, and then this duology. Orders from Berlin is now about 12 years old.
You're a barrister.
I was a criminal law barrister in England for a long time. First of all, a solicitor, and then a barrister. And then I carried on with that until I became a novelist. So
You hadn't planned as a young man to be a writer, or you? just put that aside and
No, as a young man, I was absolutely convinced as an article of faith that I couldn't write fiction. I retained that belief until I was 40, when, for whatever reasons, and there's various reasons I would guess at, I changed my mind and started writing. But until I was 40, I never wrote a word.
you've proven yourself wrong,
Yes.
and now you hit it. As we would say in America, you hit it out of the ballpark.
Thank you so much. That's a really nice thing to say. Nobody said that before, so I should remember that.
Definitely, these two books have put you on
I'm
a,
very pleased with them.
yes, a very high level. I love it. And it's like when you have with the mattress and he falls down. You have this comic release. You have a moment that the reader can take a breath and then go on to the next scene. And there's a part in one of the scenes where he's running and then he stops, and for some reason there are four brass cans and under a post, and suddenly like you stop and you say what, and then you can continue running.
I think that's interesting. These moments are really important. There's a moment in Dr. Zhivago when they are chasing a man and he stands up and he's having an effect on the crowd by speaking, but then he falls in some way and he becomes a figure of comedy and they shoot him. So these moments can go either way so quickly. And then there's a moment also when I was referring to the hotel in the cover of The Room of Lost Steps, and when they're evacuating the hotel, and there's one of these carousel, what do you call them, PatZi, where they go round and round the doors, like in the front of hotels, where you get in and the thing's turning around.
Oh,
And two of the guards who are going in, they get caught like a sort of Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton going round and round in the door, and everyone laughs, and somehow the moment is diffused, and that helps them get the soldiers out to evacuate them. So these moments between laughter and or not can have extreme effects.
there's nuances that turns a good writer into a great writer, and it's these subtle, sometimes very simple little things that make the difference, whether it's the right correct use of a verb or the correct use of a word or some little action that sets the scene for a moment. That makes the difference. But that
Doors
comes
and
from a lot of research too, and a lot of being involved in the period, knowing
Sure.
things.
Exactly.
So it's just been great talking to you. You are, and I'll have you back we'll talk about the other books soon. But one of the things is, I'm sure they've optioned this already. The sales have been terrific for book one. And I'm sure book two is opening tomorrow, and it's going to be very good. So definitely, have they optioned it already for a streaming series?
You know, PatZi, it doesn't work like that. In order to get yourself turned into film or TV, you have to be so lucky.
You're going to be lucky.
Maybe,
No,
but
no,
you
you look.
get to such a point of success, and then you have to have luck, and you have to find somebody who really likes the material. It is so difficult. And if so I hope and I try, but I don't expect.
Yeah, in the movie business, you can't.
Try to be happy with what I have. I
Yeah,
feel
that's it. Be so proud of yourself and so happy because you've done a terrific job. I read so many books. Most of the books I read, nobody's going to be reading them 50 years from now. They're just not. Probably 100 years from now, even fewer. This book, because it is so rich in history and correct in history, it's not Wikipedia history. You didn't pick it out of the.
No, I didn't.
And it's not AI written. AI would have said where they had made love. Somebody from Oxford writes where they had lain, knows the past participle, and can use it properly. So you will be read 50 years from now, because anybody who's interested, who knows what the world's going to be like, but there will always be people Like people who are interested in the Civil War, they will still read. They'll go back and read Gone with the Wind because it's also based on history. They tell the history and or any of these great
I
historical
love
books.
John with the Wind.
So this is what it will happen. Your book will be read 50 years from now, which is a
Yes,
nice thing to happen.
it's
And
early
then, of
days.
course, if they also pick it up and make it a series. I hate to say it, I prefer books. I want books, but it helps sales, first of all. You have a great story to tell here, and you tell it perfectly.
Mm.
And I'm tired of serial killer series. I need
We
a
were all tired of that.
so this will make a great series.
Spread the word, PatZi, and let's hope.
I
Right?
will. I will. Okay, and you have a website people can go to. They can find out more.
Yes.
And the books are available online wherever books are sold.
I have Instagram. I like Instagram.
Okay, good.
And I try and take photographs from the book on Instagram and then put passages from them and stories relating to them. So I do that as well. I enjoy that.
Okay, everybody check out Simon Tolkien. The new book is The Room of Lost Steps. It is fast paced. It is really fast paced. You are running along with Theo as he runs through the
It is.
things.
It's a much faster paced book than The Palace, but they both have to be as they are. But I think that's right.
It's a great book and a wonderful read, fascinating story, and people will get what they want out of it relating to current events. But Simon, again, thank you so much for joining me today.
You, PatZi, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and it's so wonderful how you've read the book in such detail and come up with such interesting questions and make me actually see some of it in new ways, which is really exciting to get from an interview. And thank you for all the nice things you've said. I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I will have you back soon, okay?
I love it. Okay, thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.